The next assignment I'd like to explain is on cellular transport. These are the ways that chemicals, molecules actually get through the cell membrane, which I described earlier this week. There are two types of cellular transport: passive transport and active transport. In passive transport, the cell does not use energy. There are three kinds of transport that are considered passive: diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and osmosis. So think of passive transport as molecules going down the hill from areas of high concentration to low concentration. It doesn't require any energy for this figure on his roller skates to go down this hill. Active transport, on the other hand, does use energy. There are three ways that you can use energy to move things through the cell membrane, either by protein pumps, endocytosis, or exocytosis. Think about this figure over here. It's going to require a lot of energy for him to climb this hill, especially with those roller skates on. So think of active transport as the molecules going from areas of low concentration up to high concentration. First, let's talk about passive transport. Again, the cell does not use any of its own energy or any energy from anything else in order to do passive transport. In this, molecules are simply randomly moving through the membrane. The molecules spread out from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So that means they start where there are many of them, and then they spread out or diffuse into areas where there are less of them. So remember, high to low. There are three kinds of passive transport: diffusion, facilitated diffusion, which is diffusion with the help of transport proteins, those carrier proteins we saw in earlier this week, and osmosis, which is the diffusion of water. Diffusion is the random movement of particles from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Think about being tightly packed into an elevator with lots of other people around you. When those elevator doors open, the natural thing to do is for you, in a high concentration, to spread out into an area where there are less people. Diffusion will continue until all the molecules are evenly spaced, which is called equilibrium. However, just because equilibrium is reached does not mean the molecules just stop moving. Molecules are constantly moving no matter what concentration level they are in. So you can see here in this animation, the molecules start in a high concentration inside the cell and randomly move out, but then they continue to move once they're out there. Diffusion, remember, requires no energy. Think about dropping some food coloring into a beaker of water. The food coloring starts out in a very high concentration, and over time, even without stirring, the food coloring molecules spread out throughout the entire beaker. Equilibrium, when molecules are evenly spaced throughout an area. So if you start out with a lump of sugar and you put it into a beaker of water, here it's in a high concentration. Over time, those molecules of sugar will spread out evenly throughout the water. In this last picture, it's said that they've reached equilibrium. Another type of passive transport is facilitated diffusion. This is the diffusion of specific particles through transport proteins found in the membrane. So you can see here, in picture A, it's showing facilitated diffusion. Picture B is just showing regular diffusion. The transport proteins are specific. They select only certain molecules to cross the membrane. Remember, proteins have their job based on their shape, and so they can select molecules based on the shape of the protein and then also the molecule. These transport proteins are otherwise known as carrier proteins, transport larger or charged molecules. The bottom picture is labeled a carrier protein, and you can see here this is a slightly different, it's not just a tunnel, but it will actually open and close based on the type of molecule that presents itself. Remember, in facilitated diffusion, you're still going from concentration levels that are high through the membrane to concentration levels that are low through a transport protein. The third type of passive transport is osmosis. This is the diffusion of water through a selectively permeable membrane. Water moves from high to low concentrations, and it goes naturally from high to low. It just moves freely throughout. The solute, which is something added to the water like salt, also is too large to move across the membrane. Osmosis is the diffusion of water. Water molecules are able to go between the phospholipids based on their size and a slight electrical charge, and it will travel to where there is a lower concentration. If you add something like salt to the solution, that changes the behavior. Remember, the rule for osmosis is that salt sucks. Water will get sucked to wherever there is a higher concentration of salt. Following slides illustrate what direction water travels if a cell is placed into areas with higher levels of salt. Remember, water is so small and there's so much of it that the cell doesn't control where it goes. Let's talk about a hypotonic solution. Hypotonic is solution that has a lower concentration of solutes and a higher concentration of water than inside the cell. If something like a blood cell were to be put into a hypotonic solution, it would cause the cell to burst. Water moves from the solution to inside the cell. The cell swells up and bursts open. This is called cytolysis. As you can see here, there is a higher concentration of salt inside the cell. So the water will move in, and the cell will swell and then burst open. In a hypertonic solution, hypertonic means there is a greater amount of salt in the outside of the cell. You can see here, only 10% salt inside, 20% salt outside, so the water will move out of the cell. If the solution is hypertonic, it has a higher concentration of solutes and a lower concentration of water. High solute, low water. This causes the cells to shrink. These pictures are of plant cells, so all of these little green things are chloroplasts. And remember that a plant cell has a cell wall. That would be this structure here. Just inside the cell wall, which we can't see, is the membrane. When placed into a hypertonic solution, the water will move out of the cell, and the cell membrane will shrink around the chloroplasts and other organelles that are in the plant cell. But the cell wall basically stays the same. This can also cause the cells to die. Water moves from inside the cell into the solution. The cell shrinks. This is called plasmolysis. An isotonic solution is where the salt levels are equal. And in this case, of course, nothing happens to the cell other than water continues to move back and forth in equal amounts. The cell would remain the same size, which is called dynamic equilibrium. So, what types of solution are these cells in? In picture A, you see this animal cell or the red blood cell shrinking. In picture B, you see the cells staying the same size. And in picture C, you're seeing the cells swelling and then bursting. A is a hypertonic solution. Remember, there's more salt on the outside, so the water goes out. B is an isotonic solution. Everything is in equilibrium. And C is a hypotonic solution, which is where there's more salt on the inside, causing the water to come in. Organisms deal with this is called osmotic pressure. Organisms deal with it in various ways. Bacteria and plants have cell walls that prevent them from overexpanding. In plants, the pressure exerted on the cell wall is called turgor pressure. This is what allows the plant leaves in a houseplant to stand up tall. When a plant is wilted and the leaves are kind of drooping over, you know that it doesn't have enough water. A protist, like a paramecium, has things called contractile vacuoles that collect water flowing in and then pump it out to prevent them from overexpanding. Saltwater fish pump salt out of their specialized gills so they do not dehydrate. And animal cells are bathed in blood. Kidneys keep the blood isotonic by removing the excess salt and water. To review passive transport, it requires no energy. It can be either diffusion or osmosis. Facilitated diffusion requires carrier proteins to help molecules across the membrane like a tunnel. And to review active transport, cells use energy. They actively move molecules to where they're needed. This is moving from areas of low concentration to high concentration. And there are 3 types. The first type is called a protein pump. Protein pump transports proteins that require energy to do work. For example, the sodium-potassium pump are important in nerve cell responses. The protein, the purple thing in the middle, changes shape in order to move the molecules. This actually requires energy, and you can see that 2 sodiums, the yellow ones, were required for every amino acid that pumped through. Another type of active transport is endocytosis. This means taking bulky material into a cell. It's kind of like it eats it. It uses energy, and the cell membrane actually folds around a food particle and then opens up on the inside, allowing that particle to be inside the cell. It's also known as cell eating. This forms a food vacuole and digests food. This is how white blood cells eat the bacteria that gets into our bodies. And another type is exocytosis. This forces materials out of the cell. It's basically the opposite of endocytosis. You've got a membrane inside the cell that surrounds whatever material you're trying to get rid of. That membrane goes over to the cell membrane, fuses with it, and then opens up. The cell changes shape, which requires energy. Hormones or wastes are released from the cell in this way. If you have any questions, be sure to ask.